Broken Circle presents Pull a String, a story preeminent fiction podcast created and narrated by Stephanie Dailey. Season 1, Unsettling Forecast, Episode 5, Fragments, Part 1. Do you love stories, especially those that are dark, strange, and uncanny? Now this is your personal invitation to come along to where safety is left behind, where so much more is possible, and everything you know might just slowly, stealthily unravel. Do you see that thread dangling in front of you? Yes, that one, along the border of the life you've woven. Go on, give it a slight pull. Can you stop the incessant urge once it has taken hold? Would you even try? Despite all this, dear friends, you have returned, standing again beside this gate of dreams. What are you exactly searching for? Insights? Some imagined revelation? Whatever your motive may be, you are welcomed back. So settle in, enjoy a rest from this troubling world. And if you have ears to hear, well, for now that same thread dangles before you yet again, and you are here eagerly reaching out. If you pull a string, well, no need to repeat the disturbingly obvious. From Stories of the Berserker Cafe, entry number 5, dated Wednesday, August 31st, 2022. In the half hour before Tim Zohar arrived, I sat there in the Berserker Cafe, watching the ebb and flow of the many tables, sipping a cappuccino and slowly finishing a cinnamon roll. Noting the time, I looked back toward the outside door. Just a moment later, and I saw Timothy Zohar stride in. Golightly followed a moment later. They were evidently already engaged in a very intense and apparently humorous conversation. At the counter, both seemed distracted enough by this that they were briefly lost just before ordering. Neither saw me at first, but instead sat down at the empty table reserved for the two of them, the chessboard already in place. Tim won again, of course, after a few very deft moves whose execution left me stunned and a bit puzzled. From where I observed all this, a table alongside the wall, any half-decent chess player could have countered at least some of those moves. I could not help but see just how eagerly everyone followed that match. But what was the significance of this odd show they'd put on? I could not help but suspect, with this ongoing rematch and so many other smaller details, the Berserker Cafe must be so much more than it had first appeared. Afterward, Tim strolled past, slowed a moment, waved quickly, and moved on toward the front. I had expected a delay. It always happened. But this time he went up and bought another coffee. Once he'd returned, I was met by a charming smile in his lively, alert eyes. He asked how I was, and for the first time I felt free enough to be a little more honest. I wasn't too specific, but work had felt weirder lately. Since a certain measure of confidentiality is necessary with my own work, I only made a few very general remarks. It sounds, he responded, as if you are right in questioning some of these oddball practices and attitudes. Tim shrugged, as if this was fairly obvious. How are things going otherwise, beyond work? Despite work, I answered. It was going well. The nice part, even with all of this brouhaha going on, I had taken a half day off and idled my way through the Akron Art Museum like an old-style flaneur, spending several quiet hours there. Have you been there? You know, the one that looks like a space plane ready for liftoff. Tim raised his left silver eyebrow. Not much for modern architecture? He was curious if that was the only nearby museum I had visited. I answered, no. I think I've visited most of those in Akron and Cleveland. I paused a moment, then asked, did you ever visit the Inventors Hall of Fame? He nodded. It was sad when it closed. Yes, that was a real loss. The building now stood empty. Have you been to the Kafka Museum? The one here, he asked. Yes, several times. Incredible how it originated, I couldn't help but say. Yes, very surprising. Most people wouldn't ever associate the two. The details of his visit are actually very remarkable. I concurred, thinking that one day there would be a tale about some lost aspect of that visit as well. One day I'd like to make it to the British Museum. I'd really enjoy exploring its artifacts, nothing like seeing them firsthand. I also mentioned I had a small collection of antiquities. I got interested in archaeology after visiting the Israel Museum when I was 16. I took out a laminated picture I kept with me. The original was in a safe place at home. This is a photo of a coin my uncle gave me a few years ago for my birthday. A tetradrum from the first year of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Tim smiled. For a moment he studied the image of the coin. This looks like an excellent example. I know a few things about ancient history. He said this in a way that suggested it was an understatement, yet not everything. Once more his face held that faraway expression. Would you be interested in hearing about an even more curious and ancient artifact, and the intriguing museum that held it? He looked at me with intense concentration, suggesting he really wanted my input. Since my lips refused to form any words, I only nodded. In a moment he continued. Visiting any number of obscure museums, curio shops, and quirky hometown historical societies is a sporadic hobby of mine. In other words, at any opportunity. Sometimes those visits have been personal and sometimes related to other matters. Tim leaned in, his hands wrapped around the warm cup on the table. Some of these local societies might be the last vestiges, perhaps, of a fading local patriotism. He shifted in his seat, easing into a more comfortable position. I sensed we were finally getting to the tale he'd chosen. Fortunately, I'd learned to start recording early. Imagine one that combined them, curios, antiquities, and regional family stories and lore, all of which were also somehow part of a strange, odd, and disturbing local history. He cleared his throat in that gruff sort of way I'd gotten used to by now. I made a visit to such a place, a visit that merely skimmed the surface by the way, in the small town of Zadok, West Virginia, along the Ohio River, not far from Sistersville. Ever heard of it? The question almost sounded like a test. I shook my head. I have heard of Sistersville. The unusual name is an attention grabber in itself. I think there is a historic hotel there? The Wells Inn? Am I mistaken? My Aunt Laura and Uncle Isaac stayed there once, I believe. My eyes darted away. I did not want to focus on my suspicions too much regarding my own family connections. From my recollection, they enjoyed themselves. For some reason, his face lit up when I mentioned my aunt and uncle. I swear he almost asked how they were doing, but instead quietly moved on. If this had been the case, then he would have been bound to explain how he knew them. Well, Zadok is a little south of Sistersville, in Shepherd County, one of many small towns that skirt the shores of the Ohio. I was already on a trip coming from Lewisburg going to the upper Michigan Peninsula. Never mind why. I had just gotten unentangled from an even more curious series of events in the middle of that state. This had already delayed me by several days, but more about that on a different occasion. There was now the merest hint of a smile on his face. But someone in my corporate department had tagged the place as of potential interest, so, given the inopportune opportunity, I dutifully went. Now, the town of Zadok is not the biggest in the region by far. It occupies only about 0.37 square miles from stem to stern. A lot of the population has bled away into bigger cities, with the oil boom just a memory from long ago, and much of that prosperity has simply trickled away. Like many places, it has its trials with alcohol and opioids. Despair and poverty have, of course, raked their ugly claws through the region several times. It is important just to note this, since it relates in a surprising way to the museum. So I arrived in town on an early Sunday evening, registered at my hotel in New Martinsville, then decided I would drive through it. This was a Sunday, and the Christian Sabbath. I knew that most of the town would be closed down. I ate dinner, then read a little, preparing myself, as I expected. Although there was an ice cream stand and sandwich shop of some kind, a couple of churches, a community center, there was nothing else besides this, but the Ohio River flowing by. My reconnoiter of the area did not take long. On a whim, I decided I would go ahead and check on the location of the museum and perhaps verify its hours. When I found the road up into the higher part of the town, it bent about sharply and went up in a straight line for a short distance, and then abruptly turned to the left. As I was driving upward, I had caught a glimpse of the town below, nestled close to the water, made tinier by the elevation I was at now. I wondered how many times the Ohio had flooded over the years. The road now leveled out, winding past a number of old homes, following a curve where I saw on the left a one-lane road that led to an old cemetery. A few trees and a line of houses temporarily blocked my view. Just past them I saw a newly built road going up a short hill. After about 50 feet, I finally saw the parking lot and then the building. Although it was only one floor, it stretched back a ways. It was partly made of brick in the middle, and off-white slats covered the front. This section, graced with a new wheelchair access ramp added, looked as if it may have once been a house or perhaps a small office. Toward the back, and for the rest of the structure, it was built from heavy concrete blocks, giving the whole an eccentric, composite appearance. I could not help but wonder if the whole thing were not the vanity project of some very wealthy entrepreneur. From the work in progress along the sides, it looked as if this back part was being covered over with real bricks, not faux ones. I also noticed that each section had a proper foundation. There was also subtle evidence that the front and middle parts of the structure were being heavily reinforced. To put it mildly, from what I had seen of the rest of the town, it looked a bit out of place. Why would anyone build a local history museum here? Was there something more behind this? Someone from the town must have had the money and resources for it all. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, a bit thrown off by this extraordinary spot. I dared hope it was nothing sinister. I had grown cynical and wary of anything that appeared too good to be true. I got out of the car so I could confirm the correct hours. It turned out it was closed on Mondays as well, although another sign promised that they would soon be expanding their hours. As I studied the front entrance, I also took note of a number of cameras, an alarm sign, and a sign with a very severe warning against trespassing. What I had seen so far had not given me any sense of the people or the place in the small Ohio river town, and this made me feel intensely curious. I longed to take in the measure of the area. Given the nature of my visit, I would probably not learn much. I was here to observe one thing, this odd, out-of-place museum. As I drove back down the hill and through the riverside section again, I sensed a certain burgeoning atmosphere here, different from those Mirkwoods and Mordors of the soul I often found myself in, as if it were in the birth pangs of becoming something altogether new. Over the years, and with a lot of instruction and insight from my teachers and mentors, I have learned how to take in the spiritual measure of a locale, a person, or an institution. As there was nothing more I could do that day, I headed back to my hotel in New Martinsville. When I arrived, a message had been left on my laptop, informing me that a few new files were waiting for me in the accordion box. As this was in 2011, the system was a tiny bit slower than today. After entering my voice authorization and pass codes, I got caught up on several current cases. While others observed, my division made attempts at a deeper and more thorough understanding of what had happened and why. We desired not simply knowledge, but insight. When I'd finished, I decided I would forego any other reading and get some rest. Early on that empty Monday, I spent some time walking around New Martinsville, a place I was totally unfamiliar with. Later on, I found a theater still playing Midnight in Paris. As a story, it was fine, but the imagined details of what a time slip was like were a bit off. Some real-life experiences can hinder the enjoyment of fictional ones, a peril which has ruined a number of fantastical stories for me. When it was over, I felt eager for the next day to begin. When morning finally came, I ate breakfast impatiently at the hotel and made my way toward Zadok. Not many people were about at this time of day. I went by the Knowles ice cream stand, which hadn't yet opened. I found an actual parking spot by the Zadok United Methodist Church, which had a brick facade, elegant arched windows, and a small bell tower. I then decided I'd scout around. My ostensible goal, if asked, was the original Zadok Pizza Company right on Riverfront Street off the Energy Highway. As I was walking along, hoping to encounter a friendly person I could ask a few questions, I saw only a few locals idling about or passing by slowly in their cars. Most merely stared. While I made my way down the street toward the pizza and sandwich shop, it was only about 11:15 in the morning, but I approached it anyway. I thought this might assuage any general suspicion of my presence. Since I wasn't a spring walker even back then, it took me a slight bit longer. As I approached the shop, a promising smell teased at my nose, and I didn't feel more than a twinge of hunger. Fortunately, the shop had opened at 11 a.m. I walked up the steps leading to the entrance and went in. I sat down at a small round table by the arched window with my sandwich and chips, looking out on the two pendants that waved in the early breeze. Across the road were a couple of houses and a cluster of tall trees. I waited for any other locals to come in, but there was only a trickle of to-go orders. The food was good, but the quiet in the place at that time was a bit eerie, and the road outside remained mostly empty. So I decided this tactic would accomplish nothing, and I'd head back to my car. As I left, I sensed a strange hesitancy even in the staff. Surely they couldn't be this way with everyone. As I went back to my car, I wondered if this level of suspicion reflected the overall community, but it was odd enough that it called attention to itself. It was a while before I figured out the source of this. When I showed up at the site of the Zadok Local History and Curio Museum, it had opened at 11 a.m., I found there were about 3 or 4 cars there already. As I approached the front, I saw the sturdy, thick, and heavy wooden door, hand-carved with ornate geometric patterns I thought I should have recognized, but did not. In a moment, I was inside and felt an even more extraordinary difference in the atmosphere. It is hard to explain exactly, but it was as if the modicum of static that had already been turned down earlier had been further reformulated into a clear, smooth melody. At the front there was a younger girl taking money for the $7 ticket price. I was a little astonished when she gave me a sweet, friendly smile while handing me back my change. I nearly stepped backwards in surprise. I managed a weak thank you and moved past the foyer toward the first of the displays and exhibits. Taking the booklet I'd been handed, opening it, I began eagerly studying its pages, standing there for a few minutes. I cannot give all the details here of the museum or its nature. There were 2 possible ways through, and you could begin at either, which would take you, as I later discovered, toward the same center point, since they were interrelated. One was for curios and artifacts, and the other through the local history exhibits. I quickly realized that what I was seeing was much better than it had any right to be in this region, in this place. Many local history societies, museums, associations struggle and get by with what they can, along with more than a few in West Virginia herself. But these were, well, exemplary, rivaling any major urban museum, or even the British Museum herself. Who could be financing this? Our preliminary investigation showed that no known secretive organizations were behind it. Whoever had done this had successfully kept their identity buried. We had no or very little indication of its existence. And why had it manifested itself in such an out-of-the-way corner? But I am getting ahead of myself here. Another fact stood out. The Zadok Local History and Curio Museum was now larger even than it had been described in the previous 2 years, when, I suppose I could describe their role as that of an agent or scout, passed through. So now it had grown by almost a third in that time. Why, and in particular, how had it done this? On this visit, I would not quite get at the heart of the mystery, although I would receive a small hint. There were treasures there I could only hint at, and an unguessed at local depth that remained hidden far below the surface. Much of the represented local history combined that of Tyler, Shepherd, and Pleasant counties. Zadok, by the way, was now in Shepherd, having been part of Tyler before the map was redrawn in 1858. Now, pieces and sections such as this were part and parcel of many museums, and as I wandered further in, the nature of the displays and exhibits began changing. The tone grew a bit more serious. At first it had been photographs, farm tools, and the display of some local crafts and folk art. But the first real indication that something unusual was going on here was what appeared to be a very large, sinister, and vicious Jenny Hanover, or what was also called a devilfish. They were supposedly a kind of mermaid, probably often made from other sea creatures or just faked outright. But this didn't resemble anything ever imagined by a sane man. The shrunken, wrinkled skin was pale, scaly, and rigid, halfway between an eel and a python. I couldn't put my mind around just how exactly it could have ended up here. I'd only heard hints of such creatures from deep time, still existing on the periphery of our reality. I won't utter its name here or anywhere else decent. Yet that someone had obtained the skin of one of them was almost beyond belief. The display indicated that it had been brought to this country from somewhere in the backwaters of Norway or Iceland. I felt a heavy fear when looking at it, especially the eye holes. It was mounted in a cabinet whose clear glass panels I noticed were extraordinarily thick. The few words identifying it suggested that it may have been employed in nefarious rituals of some kind, but now had been deemed safe. This sounded a bit like deliberate theater in my mind, meant to provoke a thrill. From my experience, I don't think it was entirely innocent. Although it was certainly dead, I did not like the thing. There was enough left of what it had been in its physical form that it made me uncomfortable. Gradually, I moved on, still somehow fascinated by the object itself. It would not be the last thing I saw in that museum that made me feel that way. In the next few rooms, the displays were smoother, less intrusive. There was an extensive exhibit on the oil boom in the area, stretching up and encompassing Sistersville and parts of Zadok. Eventually the wells nearest the river had begun running dry, and moved up into the back hills. A few were still active and had continued to produce. There were small details such as this that made the museum. The quality of it all still astonished me. I could not wrap my mind around this aspect, its stark contrast to everything else in the community. There was so much in that place that I cannot describe at all. One fact stood out. It was a flawless blend of local history and what the proprietor had modestly called curios and wonders. One room, not large, was devoted to a space where all the sounds of modern life were cut off, and only the sounds of nature were allowed within. It does not impress just hearing about it, I know, but there was something more. The central point of that room, where you could sit on a bench and just listen, was so utterly still, like the hub of a wheel. Not a single buzz, hum, or reverberation. No sound of traffic. No ever-present decibels of noise. All of them an absence. This generated a place of solitude and peacefulness no human has experienced in over 100 years. Even an Amazonian tribesman gets on the receiving end of intrusions from technology, if it is only the sound of an electric saw or in an airplane going overhead. It was almost preternatural. In front of the bench, where you could look at it or not as you saw fit, was a large photograph showing a natural scene of a wood. Every inch of it was interesting in a way I had never seen before. There were several birds which stood out among those trees, a strange plant with the most exotic-looking lavender and purple flowers, grasses and shrubs, and half-glimpsed creatures. Off in the distance was a waterfall. The water coming from this looked more pure than any I had ever seen before. On the left side were a few branches of a grand tree, from which hung a rich-looking fruit. I couldn't identify at first, but soon realized were pomegranates. It felt like a glimpse of what Eden might have looked like at the dawn. When I emerged from that room, I felt both refreshed and troubled by the clatter and clutter, the ugliness and neglect of beauty in my own existence. And the stillness. Jonah, you cannot imagine what a still point was in that single room, the absolute moment of utter beauty. I still do not know how they kept it cool inside. It must have been a strange and marvelous feat of engineering. I will share one more bit of wondrous strangeness before getting to the central exhibit. In another room was an exhibit devoted to a composer I had, at the time, never heard of before, Richmond Davies Black. Inside this room, they played a 20-minute excerpt of a much longer work. I have set all my wonders before you. I heard a flute, violin, a zither, and what I think was a hurdy-gurdy, perhaps others I couldn't identify. All these instruments combined in surprising ways. and at times seemed a voice emerged from them speaking in unknown tongues, blending into all of pain and groaning and quiet hope of, well, everything. They seemed answered by a different quality, sound, harmony. This is particularly hard for me to describe, but it was as if the answer emerged from within the pain of the ashes themselves, and pulled all things upward into a strange, ethereal realm. I had never heard such aching beauty. It was pain and suffering and tragedy transformed into a new, glorious melody, as if the worst things that could happen were simply not strong enough that its themes could be silenced, but instead came up and through that very weakness, loss, and utter lack of strength. I cannot describe it adequately. Tim fell silent here a moment, his eyes full of strange memory. It was not as if it negated these things or treated them as ordained or purposeful, but rather took them, purged them of their power to harm, and changed the pain into an ache, into a loss that was then negated, and whose wound was transformed, lifted upward into a state where every fulfillment that could be imagined was possible. A reversal that not only stripped it of its power, but imploded all of its effects. I cannot do it justice. The sigh that came next was one of utter longing and contentment, but you could not help but be moved very deeply, and even that excerpt adjusted how you viewed the world. I cannot imagine what listening to the whole thing, the complete piece was 2 hours and 25 minutes long, would do to a person. I still cannot shake that melody and its permutations. At times the world seems so full of beauty and wonder, I cannot stand it, and my eyes can still tear up, although I never know just why exactly. On one side of the room used for this exhibit stood an ancient-looking harp. Something about it seemed so familiar. A large panel waist-high described it as a reproduction of an ancient lyre, of which there were 9 examples known. This particular reproduction had been in the hands of an old family somewhere in New England and had been donated for its association with the music I had been so touched by. There were other photos, pictures, and ephemera associated with Richmond Davies Black in that room, but I cannot take the time now to catalog all of them. I think now that every display and description prepared you for the next one, and that cumulatively, in a combination of awe, dread, and wonder, it did not leave anyone untouched or unchanged, for better or for worse. It might just reveal the hearts of many. I do not understand how anyone could just intend this and carry it off. I have seen power and enchantment misused, but never crafted so well. I did not know it at the time, but some of these effects and changes were observed by other wily people who did not care for them or the outcomes. And as I would learn, they had acted against the museum in vain. Now we come to the center of the museum. This was the room of the shards, fragments of an ancient weapon, it was supposed. In one corner was what it appeared a reference to where they had been discovered in an indentation under a hill that had cave-like properties. This region of West Virginia had a lack of natural caves, and this made it all the more odd and striking, the exhibit panel stated. The only other instance of a mysterious cave was a place called Sharpen's Cleft, also further up in the hills. This was a place associated with some peculiar local legends. Although the text did not elaborate on this point, my heart was beating hard at seeing the name. Was this where they had arrived from that other place, I wondered? There were 3 display cases along this one wall. The first on the left was a reproduction of what Goliath's huge spear would have looked like, and on the other was a recreation of his sword. I did not understand at this point the depth of what I was seeing. As I began looking at those 3 metal fragments in the center, I saw how each was mottled and cracked, their texture and sheen looking like a combination of cobalt, silver, and iron. And yet their edges still looked dangerously sharp after all their supposed millennia of existence. A stark and deep impression of frightening antiquity swept through me. It suddenly struck me how ancient these shards must be in actuality, older than any sword from the Middle Ages, than Rome, Hammurabi, the earliest Bronze Age examples, or maybe older than Göbekli Tepe itself. This weapon must be the great ancestor of the very first swords we had uncovered. What was I looking at? How had an object from an elder age been placed here? Jonah, there were things made in the ancient world that would astonish you. Objects that were not conceived through science, at least as we understand it, but through a craft whose skills have long since passed from this world, employing at times darker methods and at others a technique of light. They are now behind a sealed door that no man can open. You must realize that although we do know a lot about certain periods of history, we have some true knowledge of the past. There are gaps, mysteries, and enigmas we cannot account for. For even the most thoroughly attested centuries we know only in part. We make educated guesses, inferences, and skillful reconstructions, but pieces are missing. We have only these fragments, many and scattered, with some periods far better attested. Yet in some instances we cannot know fully what happened, and what nightmares or fantastical things may have existed right alongside what we can see, but as a consequence of this sparse understanding escape our notice. So it is with the most ancient points of our past. Just as my halting appreciation and awareness of absolute wonder and mystery was becoming most acute, I heard for the first and nearly last time those crushed and speedy whispers. They emanated from somewhere around me. What the speech was supposed to be is still unknown to me, but I was privileged to have them unveiled. At least that was the sense of it. They only wanted to be reunited together so they might flourish again. Here in this place they had grown enervated and listless, held from their purpose. Only a small thing, the least thing, was required for its restoration. The images it tenaciously planted in my mind were for sacrifices of a sort where, need I say, the poor victims lingered on. This was the small price it, whatever it was, desired. I saw myself with the restored and holy weapon as a conquering hero, shaping the world as I wanted it. I knew two things at once. First, I would not be the one whose vision would be perpetrated upon reality, but would be controlled by it. And second, it would not hesitate to feed upon anything or anyone. I would be its last, or merely most convenient victim, any time I was found suitable. The image of a bloody, confused Don Quixote given full, ultimate power flitted through my mind. The spell or fell vision, whatever kind of sorcery it was, slid off me. The next thing I heard was a voice. They are a bit much. Simple things, really. Simple-minded, if the truth be told. Fascinating, though. Staring at them makes the funniest, most peculiar things go through your mind, don't you think? I stared at this person for a moment, then nodded. No one I know has quite succumbed to their own imagination, though. Those two objects, the spear and the sword, on either side, were reproduced as counterbalances for all of its nonsense. I stammered out my question. Are you saying that you are aware of the nature of those? He nodded. Fragments, shards, pieces? Oh yes, but they are broken. And every attempt that got them fitted back together would only destroy what remained. You cannot imagine, if you haven't handled them, just how fragile they are in reality. Yet we keep watch against its dreams. He peered at me for a moment. Do we know each other? He asked. For the first time, I did look at him closely. No, I don't believe so. He smiled and said, One meets with so many different, interesting people in this place of wonders. I'm Enos Lawrence, one of the curators here. You seem a bit different from the usual visitors we have had. I couldn't help but notice when you walked in. Many questions now pushed themselves forward in my mind, dancing about, clamoring for attention. There were a dozen mysteries I wanted, no needed answers for. Not least how anyone here could afford all of this professional luxury and expertise in a small river town such as Zadok. I blurted out my question. Before Mr. Lorenz could answer, we were interrupted. It was at this moment I became aware of something else. A wave swept upward through me. I have become as sensitive as any human being can be, but this was a surprise. You cannot be trained for this. It is not a gift of second sight as most people think of it, but rather a skill, an intuition acquired through long experience. I stood in the midst of a storm, beating all around me. Beneath my feet, going down through the building's foundations, past compressed soil, descending through bedrock, I sensed something strange had occurred here that made it stand out. Whatever it was, whether it was of darkness or of light, it was effective and perilous, glorious and potent at the same moment. I caught my breath. Mr. Lorenz moved toward me, and in the sudden shadow that passed between us, I did not know if his face bore deep concern or ill will. But my body refused any movement, any action, and I was strangely bound into the rock below me. I also felt something reaching out toward me, a stifling field stretching out into my throat and nostrils, stealing the air I breathed and replacing it with what felt like tar. Had it sensed something inside me, some difference or latent awareness that now made it even more aggressive? I dodged its efforts. All of this was such a deep, personal intrusion. I had no way of knowing if my companion would even notice. The only possible external sign was a slight trembling in both hands. The sudden blank stare I assumed was now on my face. Further, I did not know what side of the skirmish he might be on. As I tried to move, he seemed quiet and indifferent without awareness of my plight. I had no choice but resisting this intruder as long as I could. I knew those shards, the fragments, were now aggressively coming for me in ways I could not imagine. And so, dear listeners, we must part for a short time. Yet, as I have seen you through in the past, so I will continue abiding here with you, a voice in the dark, a companion in this night, bringing these tales from far away and delivering them close to home. This has been a Story Preeminent Fiction podcast, presented by Broken Circle, Pull a String. Created, conducted, and narrated by Stephen Dailey. Photographed by Stephanie Dailey. Music courtesy of Scott Buckley. If you enjoyed this, please remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Next episode, Fragments, Part 2.